Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 7th of May, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information, which you can find right here on the Alaska Weather Show, 365 days a year. Thanks for joining us. And a good number to keep by the phone, 1-800-472-0391. Go ahead and punch that into your contacts while we stand here for a minute. And you can always find that information at weather.gov/Alaska. In fact, the maps and images that you see on Alaska Weather each night are available at this address. Just scroll down a little bit and you'll see TV weather at the bottom of the page. Click on that button and you'll find these maps through the evening and overnight. In the morning, we start to replace them with more current information, and we'll direct you to those links as we go. As always, if you can't find what you're looking for when you come to our website, when you come to that phone number, when you're watching the show, let us know. Let me know. I'm happy to change and work on things as best I can to meet your needs, no matter what part of Alaska you're watching from tonight. So thank you. Here's a look at what's going on across the region tonight. We have wind moving through the eastern Alaska Range, the Dehne and Tanana Flats region, and the upper 40-mile country in the Tanana Valley. Because of that, two things are going on. First of all, it's just breezy, and it might be blowing some things around. If you left the trash can out today, it's probably going down the road just a little bit there. And, if you've done a little bit of work cleaning up the yard, well, some of that might have to be readdressed once again. The other part, though, that's probably a little more concerning, though, is that it's drying conditions out around the region. And as we're in the drier part of the year right now, despite the rain we've seen in southeast, this is something to keep mindful of, because it's creating low humidity as wind is rushing down and over those mountains. And if a wildfire were to begin, it could make that even worse. Now, in some of these cases there, especially around the Delta area, of course, we know that wildfire conditions are already high and things are burning. So this is not the best news that you want when folks are out there working on fires, or at least keeping watch on them. So your job then with this information is to be careful with fire and be mindful that today and tomorrow may not be the best days to do any local burning where you are if you're trying to reduce your trash pile out there. Make sure that you check in with your local fire officials in your community before you light off one of those fires there, because this, again, is not the kind of situation where it'd be a really good idea to do that. Now, with that knowledge, let's take a look at Southeast, because Southeast has had rainfall. In fact, here are 24-hour rainfall totals across Southeast. Now, I don't have any of the cities plotted on here, but Juneau is right here. It picked up about a half inch in the last 24 hours, and quarter to a half inch there through Cross Sound, out toward Gustavus, up toward Glacier Bay, about the same. Haines and Skagway, a little bit less for sure, but down toward Sitka, over an inch, around 1.2 inches or so, in fact. And you can see kind of hit and miss about a third to a half inch across many other locations. So it has been rain, kind of garden variety stuff there. Maybe not a toad strangler, as we'd say down in the lower 48, but certainly one that has brought some much needed precipitation to at least a few places. So hopefully you had some of that. Here's a look at the breakup map as we're talking about water. Water is not necessarily flowing quickly yet down the Yukon. You can see generally conditions are still mostly closed up with ice up and down the Yukon Valley, with the exceptions of some of the lower Yukon Valley there. The Tanana, the Susitna, the Kuskokwim, of course, mostly, if not completely, open. And we'll continue to watch for changes there. Hopefully we'll have an update for you again on Thursday from the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. But in the meantime, you can check out this map anytime you want, as well as updated breakup conditions from our partners, the Department of Homeland Security here in Alaska, and of course the folks that are out there on the River Watch flights, by going to weather.gov/APRFC, which is Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center for short. And make sure that if you see changing conditions on your part of the river, that you let us know. There's contact information on the website there, and again, your reports certainly do help keep the information going and keep people in your community safe. Fire dangers we saw around the eastern Alaska Range and the Delta and Tanana Flats regions, probably high to extreme right now, pushing that extreme level there with the red flag warnings. As we look up toward the Kobuk and Noatak valleys, and then down the river, down the Koyukuk toward Galena, then also in southwest, we see developing areas of high fire danger there as things are drying out, and that goes for the Anchorage Bowl through the Kenai Peninsula, just about to Homer, maybe not quite that far south, and around the Matanuska and Susitna Valley, as well as the Copper River Basin. So once again, be careful with fire. Here's a look at the satellite picture now, and the broad circulation that we have in our upper air pattern is carving out a very large trough, or a dip in the jet stream, which is allowing low pressure at the upper levels of the atmosphere to drive low pressure at the surface and kind of zing those in from south to north, one right after the other. So right now we're in a little bit of a lull. We've had one wave pass through, and that brought us some rain earlier in the weekend. Another wave was working through late last night and early this morning, and southeast had a little bit of rain from that same wave as now. Now everything's kind of regrouping. There's another wave of low pressure working its way northward, and we'll see the process pretty much repeat all over again. Up north, high pressure is in charge, and that's giving us that murky color you see across the coastal plain and the north slope. That's low clouds, low moisture, and you're seeing a little bit of snow from that and a little bit more of stratus from that. But most of what we're seeing elsewhere is being controlled by that warm, wet flow working its way in across the Gulf into southeast, wrapping over the mountains and into the Bering Sea, where we run back into that northerly flow again and low clouds on the backside of low pressure sitting off the west coast. That low's around 984 millibars right now, and it's part of that parent system in the upper levels that you'll see here in the aviation forecast in a minute. We'll explain a little bit more of that trough that we're talking about. But you see that overall southerly flow working its way across the Gulf, warm air lifting northward into the coastal mountains, and we get a lot of rain from that. A trough of low pressure is also sitting across the interior and close to the eastern Alaska range. That's really going to fall apart with any major temperature difference tonight, but it will be the focus for rain to the south of it. On the north side, that's where we get into that drier setup that's not so good for fire weather conditions. The colder air is present across the north, but it's really going to have more of an impact over into Canada and drop its way southward in time. And low pressure across the west is filling in. That means it's losing some of its potency and strength. It still has the ability to bring in some rain showers across west and southwest, but periods of rain and snow will continue across the Bering Strait, and most of that will stay well away from where we live. Wednesday's weather looks fairly warm for most locations. In fact, 50s and 60s may be found. In fact, it does look even warmer than that around Fairbanks, where temperatures will continue to be fairly mild as we go through the rest of the week. Watch for areas to see a possibility of building clouds around the Alcan border, around Eagle and Northway. Chances are that's where it'll be confined. Not a very broad area, but one that could cause you a little bit of travel troubles if you're flying. Make sure you want to avoid that kind of area. And we certainly hope that we don't get a whole lot of thunderstorm activity in these already very dry conditions in the region. Up north, periods of snow are possible, but you're more likely to see low clouds and fog across the north coast on Wednesday. Most of the snow will probably be over higher terrain. Low pressure sitting across the YK Delta will hover just offshore, but it's enough to keep that south and westerly flow moving into Bristol Bay and Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula, where rain is more likely than anything else. Showers will continue across the north and eastern Gulf Coast. High pressures parked just south of Haida Gwaii, keeping that southerly flow intact. That's about 1,033 millibars. Close enough to count, but not strong enough to really break up all of the clouds where we are. We'll see a better chance of that happening as we get into Thursday, and some of that sunshine might break out across southern parts of Sitka all the way down toward the Clarence Strait and Dixon Entrance region up toward the capital city. North of that, a better chance for rain to continue around Haines and Skagway. Low pressure sitting very close to Kodiak will keep a stronger wind going into the Kenai Fjords region, Prince William Sound, and maybe even a moderate to occasionally heavy rain there. High pressure up north keeps low clouds across the north slope, and low pressure in the west should keep things unsettled for sure across the west coast, with showers continuing for the Aleutians. Overnight lows tonight in the 40s for southeast, 30s and 40s for south central, almost 40 in Kodiak, 40 for Sandpoint, Dutch Harbor, and Alaska, just above freezing for St. Paul. The interior is looking at temps in the lower to mid 40s thanks to that warming wind blowing in from the south, and low to mid teens for the north slope. Nome, you're looking at 35. High temperatures there tomorrow, 40. Look at the interior, mid 50s to lower 60s, south central 40s and 50s for you.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to aviation weather now, with a quick succession of low pressure systems moving up on a southerly flow over the Gulf. We're going to keep a lot of different areas under MVFR and IFR in the coming days. You're going to see a lot of that in the Gulf of Alaska, especially around Prince William Sound, the Kenai Fjords region to the Wrangell St. Elias area, and certainly southeast. It's going to be on the eastern side of the low, which means a lot of that slop is going to be coming your way. We're going to see more breaks across the interior where downsloping is occurring. Watch for VFR across the 40-mile country, the upper Tanana, the upper Yukon, all the way into parts of the western Alaska range, and then we'll get back into kind of the slop over the Bering Sea. And the cold north flow pushing up against the Brooks Range will keep things low across some of the lower terrain there of the north slope. Look for IFR to start your Wednesday morning. As we get into the afternoon, because of the breaks, because of the sunshine and the heating taking place, we see potential for convection across the upper Yukon Valley and the upper Tanana Valley. So watch for some of that to build up in the afternoon. You'll also see IFR conditions around Yakutat, west toward Cordova, and then south out over the open water, but a lot of breaks. This is kind of the lull between the current weather wave that's working northward and what's to come across the deeper south parts of the Gulf of Alaska. Watch for IFR across the Bering Strait, widespread MVFR across southwest, the Aleutian Chain, and into Kodiak Island. As we get into Thursday, you can see IFR is building back in, and west just a little bit across the Gulf, hit and miss around Chilkoot and White Pass. South of that, for the most part, looking at marginal conditions through southeast in the morning. The north slope IFR around AKwx all the way down toward UAFTV and eastward toward IFR conditions in north of AKwx and Dehne Pass and Arctic Village, and to the west, IFR through the Bering Strait and also across the western chain. By the afternoon, you can see IFRs building back in as the next low approaches. Watch for marginal conditions along the outer coast. Some breaks as you head through the inner channels in the south. Marginal conditions widespread across the north, but conditions are actually improving at this point. And then IFR through most of the Bering Strait, and then hit and miss across Kiska and Adak, Atka, and northward towards St. Matthew. Marginal conditions around the southwest coast with VFR widespread across most of the Yukon Valley. So a lot to take in there. As we look at your pass conditions in detail, take a look at this. AKwx Pass and Dehne Pass will probably lean toward IFR as the day goes on. As you go down to the south, you'll see some brief improvements for a day or so. Marginal to VFR conditions are expected. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, and for Rainy Pass. Windy Pass probably improves throughout the day. Isabel Pass will follow suit. Marginal conditions, at least to start, maybe leaning over toward VFR. Mentasta Pass holds at a marginal levels, and remember, the further north you go, the closer you're going to get into some of that convective possible type weather there, so keep that in mind. Tanita Pass probably flips over hard to VFR conditions there. It may be a slow process in the morning, but it does look like you may see an IFR start with that wave moving through. Portage Pass probably doesn't make it that well. IFR conditions too, marginal conditions at best, and then again leaning back over toward IFR in the morning. Chilkoot and White Pass, it's going to be hit and miss throughout the entire region there in northern parts of southeast. There's a chance that you may see MVFR to maybe even VFR levels of improvement, but check, know before you go, take a look at the cameras, but it does look like there will be at least some IFR in the area. Freezing levels show that warm air is really surging hard across the eastern Gulf. With wave after wave after wave, we just keep pulling more and more and more warm air across the eastern Gulf, but the consequence is that out in the west, levels are coming down. You see the surface freezing line there around St. Matthew, the chain below freezing in some cases there, the 2,000-foot freezing line right over the west coast and right along the spine of the Brooks Range, it looks like, with levels across the interior between 4, 6, and even 8,000 feet around Northway and Eagle. Icing potential is somewhat limited. It's high up there, around 6,000 to 7,000 feet or so across the west coast, above 9,000 feet from UAFTV to AKwx to Kaktovik. Isolated convection again means there could be some isolated severe icing too, and icing across southeast is way up there above 10,000 feet. Here's the jet. High pressures across the eastern Gulf right now. Wind speeds coming in from the south at 150 knots. Southerlies across northern Alaska and northerlies across the western Bering around 90 to 140 knots. A broad area of southerly flow across Alaska right now, anywhere from 15 to 50 knots coming in from due south. Southerlies continue across Bristol Bay, about 15 to 25. At 3,000 feet, a similar pattern here. A little slower winds, 15 to 25 for the east. North and easterly winds across the north slope at this level, 15 to 20. And north and westerlies across the central and western chain with low pressure parked north of St. Matthew, north of Nunivak Island. You get a little bit more of an offshore flow out of Nome, Norton Sound, and Kotzebue Sound with this type pattern. Turbulence, then we'll be watching for the eastern Alaska range around Prince William Sound. Southeast looks okay. Look for considerable moderate turbulence around southwestern Alaska and across the Bering Strait, generally below 4,000 feet, 6,000 feet though around south central.
Floating hundreds of miles from Earth, astronauts get a unique perspective of our planet. While they might recognize landmarks, space is the only place they can see the very edge of our planet's atmosphere.
From orbit, particularly looking at the horizon, did bring to mind how thin the atmosphere is. It's like an onion skin around this great big ball of the Earth.
This uppermost layer of Earth's atmosphere, the ionosphere, also overlaps with the very beginning of space. It's the job of NASA's new mission, GOLD, the Global Scale Observations of the Limmendisk Instrument, to study this region, a region that isn't just for astronauts to explore, but that affects humans every day down on the ground. For one thing, this layer of the upper atmosphere helps protect us from harmful radiation and energy emanating from the sun. But in our modern society, it does so much more. It affects the smartphone that sits in your pocket and the radio waves that guide our airplanes. The ionosphere is a crucial layer of the atmosphere through which our communications and GPS signals travel. And when this region changes, it impacts those communication signals. Changes can occur above this region from the sun's activity, also known as space weather. Changes can also occur below from Earth's weather, such as hurricanes and wind patterns. GOLD connects the dots between how space weather and Earth's weather shape the upper reaches of the atmosphere. But this region isn't easy to study. The ionosphere spans roughly 60 to 400 miles from Earth's surface, which is too high for aircraft and scientific balloons, and the lower regions are too low to easily study with satellites. What are attainable, however, are the swaths of red and green light shining out from the upper atmosphere. Formed when the sun's rays hit atmospheric molecules, this light, named airglow, comes from green and red bands of glowing gas. Some of the airglow is invisible to our eyes, shining in infrared and ultraviolet light, which can only be seen with scientific instrumentation. Taking advantage of our planet's natural glow is gold. The gold instrument, which is about the size of a mini-fridge, is hitching a ride on a commercial communication satellite, SES-14. The satellite's orbit lies 22,000 miles above Earth, where it can record images in ultraviolet light to monitor changes in airglow across the globe. These images give information on the temperature, density, and composition of particles in the upper atmosphere. Gold collects these observations faster than any mission has ever done before. It captures an image of Earth's entire disk every 30 minutes, allowing scientists to see how the upper atmosphere evolves throughout the day. Gold joins a host of missions studying the very nature of space, around Earth, the Sun, and planets. As NASA ventures farther and farther from home, knowing the nature of space itself is crucial for our journey to understand our solar system and beyond.
There's a new class of chemical compounds impacting the Earth's ozone layer and raising concerns among some scientists. But a new NASA analysis indicates stratospheric ozone could actually be impacted more by climate change and the continued release of already banned chemicals. The Earth's ozone hole is showing signs of recovery, decades after the landmark agreement called the Montreal Protocol that banned many chemical compounds harmful to the ozone layer.
So we know the Montreal Protocol was a huge success. This was signed in the late 1980s when scientists and policymakers from around the world gathered together to try to save the ozone layer.
The chemicals they regulated persist in the atmosphere for many decades. They thin the ozone layer and they create a seasonal hole over Antarctica. They basically take away part of our planet's natural sunscreen, and that increases the risk of skin cancer and damage to plants.
Scientists have projected the ozone hole could disappear almost completely by about 2075, but several factors could delay that recovery.
There are some industrial compounds that are not banned by the Montreal Protocol, but as they enter the atmosphere, they will also hurt the ozone layer.
But the unregulated compounds have a short lifespan in the atmosphere, unlike the chlorofluorocarbons that were originally regulated. So they have a short-lived impact on ozone, and we don't think they'll delay recovery by more than a few years.
We projected by 2050, more than half of the ozone-depleting compounds in the atmosphere will come from long-lived substances banned by the protocol.
Because these compounds stay in the air for such a long time, compared to the unregulated, short-lived compounds, they will have a disproportionate and lingering impact on ozone. So any non-compliance with the protocol can have significant consequences.
And the really big uncertainty in ozone layer recovery is climate change. There are many naturally produced ozone-depleting substances that are emitted by the oceans. And as the oceans continue to warm due to climate change, those emissions will increase, and that will further delay ozone recovery.
Scientists want to better understand how climate change will affect ozone recovery.
This is a hard problem. As a scientific community, we need to work on this major issue. We now have a powerful new tool to simulate atmosphere and its interaction with land and ocean to study this issue. And that's what we're going to do.
How can you see the atmosphere? The answer is blowing in the wind. Tiny particles known as aerosols are carried by the air around the globe. This visualization uses data from NASA satellites combined with our knowledge of physics and meteorology to track three aerosols: dust, smoke, and sea salt. Sea salt, shown here in blue, is picked up by winds passing over the ocean. As tropical storms and hurricanes form, the salt particles are concentrated into the spiraling shape we all recognize. With their movements, we can follow the formation of Hurricane Irma and see the dust from the Sahara, shown in tan, get washed out of the storm center by the rain. Advances in computing speed allow scientists to include more details of these physical processes in their simulations of how the aerosols interact with the storm systems. The increased resolution of the computer simulation is apparent in fine details like the hurricane bands spiraling counterclockwise. Computer simulations let us see how different processes fit together and evolve as a system. By using mathematical models to represent nature, we can separate the system into component parts and better understand the underlying physics of each. Today's research improves next year's weather forecasting ability. Hurricane Ophelia was very unusual. It headed northeast, pulling in Saharan dust and smoke from wildfires in Portugal, carrying both to Ireland and the UK. This aerosol interaction was very different from other storms of the season. As computing speed continues to increase, scientists will be able to bring more scientific details into the simulations, giving us a deeper understanding of our home planet.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And on to your sea ice update now. You can always find this at weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. Alaska Sea Ice Program gives us the update that there's still some higher concentration ice right there in the Bering Strait. We've got a northerly flow working its way through the Chukchi Sea right now, but the overall flow just south of that is really, especially over the west coast, primarily southerly. So we're getting a lot of warming and melting along coastal conditions here in the Norton Sound, but we still have just enough of a northerly flow that some of this may be working its way southward. And there may be some new ice forming here in the next couple days, as the overall pattern really doesn't seem to change very much. So keep your eyes open for that. Otherwise, a generally very broad area of marginal ice conditions continues to be seen there in the Chukchi Coast, Kotzebue Sound, and through the Bering Strait north of St. Lawrence Island. Here's a look at the forecast now for southeast. Winds will be generally light across the Inside Passage, 10 to 15 knots there and 2 to 3 foot seas. Stronger winds coming in from the south across the Lynn Canal, 30 knots and 6 foot seas there. And the overall flow across the outer coast is about 15 to 20 knots from the south, 25 knots as you get up toward Yakutat and west toward Prince William Sound. Seas offshore about 8 to 9 feet or so up to the coastal areas. There is some slightly higher seas out over the open water. Across the region on Thursday, south and southeasterly winds will be the primary flow there with about 10 to 20 knots, generally looking at about 8 to 9 feet. On the inside, 10 to 15 knot winds and 2 to 3 foot seas for your Thursday. Looks like a generally pleasant day. Watch for showers rolling around through the area. South and southwesterly winds will be the flow over south central. Looks like Prince William Sound is expecting 15 knots and 3 foot seas. South and westerly winds across the north and western Gulf, 20 knots with 9 to 10 foot seas and 5 to 6 foot seas across Cook Inlet, looking for winds around 20 knots or so as we get into your Thursday. Winds pick up to small craft advisories across the region for most of the Kenai Fjords region outside of Resurrection Bay and through southern Cook Inlet, 30 to 35 knots with 9 to 10 foot seas. Northeasterlies to 15 inside of Prince William Sound, and northeasterlies to 20 across northern Cook Inlet with a 5 foot sea and 8 foot seas outside of Hitchinbrook entrance. For Bristol Bay, look for southerlies, 25 knots and 5 foot seas there. And the overall flow for the entire region is running around 20 to 25, looking for about 8 to 9 foot seas in most regions, about 5 to 6 foot seas across the Bering Sea coast. That diminishes as we get into your Thursday. Easterly flow coming through Bristol Bay, southeasterlies down the coast at 15 knots, and northeasterlies a little bit stronger through Shelikof Strait as low pressure is working its way northward. The backside of that low will be a little bit stronger, but you can see winds fall off fairly quickly as you head down towards Sand Point and Falls Pass with a 6 foot sea. For Wednesday in the chain, 15 to 20 knots will do it for just about every area on the map here. 5 to 9 foot seas across the central and eastern chain, 7 to 9 foot seas across the Pacific coast waters, north and westerly winds as you head out to the west, 8 to 9 foot seas tops from AKwx westward. As we get into Thursday, winds diminish in most areas. You'll see a little bit of a variable flow as the winds kind of try and get their act together, but no general pattern here except for one lightly from the west. Most cases there. You're looking at about 4 to 6 foot seas and about 6 to 7 foot seas as you head out to the west. Slightly stronger winds out there up to 20 knots. Across the west coast, a southeasterly wind around 20 knots for Norton Sound, 4 foot seas there. An onshore flow on either side of Nunivak Island. Macoriac looking at about 6 foot seas with 20 knot winds. Southerlies across the Kuskokwim Delta up to 25 knots and 7 foot seas. Winds a little bit stronger out towards St. Matthew up to 30 knots there with a 9 foot sea. And for Thursday, a south and easterly flow will continue. Remember, low pressure is kind of lurking right here across the YK Delta. Southeasterlies will be fairly light around St. Paul and St. George with a 5 foot sea. Across the Beaufort Seacoast, easterlies continue to blow over the ice, 20 to 25 knots there. The Chukchi Coast with some open water now, north and easterly winds, anywhere from 4 to 7 foot seas on that 25 knot wind. Winds will be a little stronger through the Bering Strait, up to 30 knots with an 8 foot sea. For Thursday, a light northeasterly flow working through the Beaufort, 10 to 15 knots, a little bit more of a northerly flow, in fact, for the eastern Beaufort Seacoast. East and northeasterlies working off the Chukchi Coast. From Wainwright down to Kivalina, you should see about 15 to 20 knots and about 4 to 5 foot seas there. Top southeasterlies a little bit stronger through the Bering Strait, up to 25 knots on Thursday. Recapping tonight's weather, what you see is what you get. Weather patterns really aren't going to change a whole lot from today, tonight, all the way through really about Thursday and Friday. Low pressure will continue to bring in waves of rain across the Gulf Coast and plenty of clouds for south central, southwest, and southeast. For the interior, watch for pretty dry conditions and winds off the Alaska Range that could make fire danger a little bit higher where you are. Red flag warnings and wind advisories are in effect now for the eastern Alaska Range, the Deltana, Tanana Flats region, the upper Tanana, and the 40-mile country. There could be a few clouds that bubble up into showers, maybe even a thunderstorm across the Alcan border as we go through the daytime tomorrow. And areas of light snow and fog will be found across the North Slope into the Chukchi Coast with warmer weather and periods of rain across south and west. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.